Dr. Josette Baer, professor at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Zurich, is a lecturer in political theory with a special focus on Central and Eastern Europe. She's currently teaching a class on Thomas Sowell, the noted American economist and author. Dr. Baer will provide a focus on Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union and the satellite states in Eastern Europe in her reflections on cancel culture from a historical perspective.
Thank you, Melissa and John O'Sullivan, for the invitation to this conference. I'm, of course, very happy to be here. This is what I'm going to talk about today. It's the structure of my presentation. First, I'm going to redefine cancel culture, then introduce briefly 5 critics of censorship. Part 3 is dedicated to 2 important definitions. Part 4, I'm going to speak briefly about a particularly important relationship between the elite and the mob that happened in 20th century and that I see happening today on US campuses. And I'm going to conclude with an attempt to politically classify the IP movement that came up, that invented the concept of cancel culture. Cancel culture is nothing new at all. It boils down to the simple but effective concept of censorship in the newspeak and social media of the 21st century, controlled and managed by big tech. Censorship in our days is not yet exercised by governments, but by mass media, IP activist groups, and the student mob on various campuses. Culture is not the same as a cult, although both concepts derive from the Latin colere, meaning to inhabit, to cultivate, to worship. We could say that a culture is something positive that unites people who produce and create and pray together, whereas a cult is rather negative in our understanding, since it divides people into the initiated, heeding the cult's creed, and those who are not. If we take seriously the resistance against this movement, which Douglas Murray so aptly called the madness of crowds, I think it appropriate not to use their newspeak slogans and mottos, but to replace them with our own definitions, in our own language, committed to objectivity and facts. I therefore suggest to replace cancel culture, or the culture of cancelling, with the cult of censorship, which is exercised by the self-appointed apostles of identity politics, IP. Now, what is IP? It is the appendix of postmodernist qua-Marxist theory, created mainly by French philosopher Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984, and the charlatan Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004. Let us delve for a couple of minutes into French political thought. Had Derrida been truthful, thorough, and serious, thus a true scholar, had he applied his method of deconstruction to his own texts, he would have probably found that he had nothing significant to say at all and thus cancelled himself. Unfortunately, he did not. And today, cohorts of university teachers and students are applying his nonsensical deconstruction to whatever theme takes their fancy, prompting results or knowledge that nobody capable of thinking independently and critically can accept as logically consistent, let alone based on facts. In my opinion, the most decent French thinker who was committed to the truth, the brutal political reality in the socialist bloc, was Raymond Aron, 1905 to 1983, who referred to the Western left as being high on the dope of Marxism. His most impressive study, L'opium des intellectuels, the opium of the intellectuals, was published in Paris in 1955. Aron was a champion of free speech, condemning the inhumanity of Nazi ideology, Stalinism, and Maoism. He knew what he was talking about because he had lived in Berlin in the 1930s, witnessing the Nazi rise to power. Jean-Paul Sartre, on the contrary, had no personal experience of a totalitarian regime. Sartre, whom we could and indeed should refer to as the Prince Mandarin of hypocrisy, spoke highly of Mao's peasant communism, praising it as a political solution for the post-industrialist Western capitalist societies, while sipping wine at the Café des Flores on Paris Rive Gauche, enjoying the liberty granted by the French state. Now back to IP. In their analysis, Cynical Theories, published 2020, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay identify 4 major themes of postmodernism. First, the blurring of boundaries. For example, Madonna's well-meant but nonsensical saying, "We are all one," meaning that we are all equal, which is very easy to say from a Hollywood mansion that is guarded by armed security personnel. Someone born into the Indian case of the untouchables, with no opportunity for social mobility whatsoever, might beg to differ. Second, the power of language. For example, words are violence. Please show me a word that kills like a machine gun. Third, cultural relativism. For example, all cultures are equal, none is superior. A Somali girl who is forced to undergo female circumcision, that is genital mutilation, would most certainly prefer to live in a state where that practice is punished by law. And fourth, the loss of the individual and the universal. For example, the view that human rights do not exist since they are a narrative established by a power elite of white, male, sexist, and racist imperialists. What are the roots of our Western civilization? The Greeks, as Victor Davis Hanson and John Robert Heath demonstrated in their Who Killed Homer? Let us have a look at a courageous young woman. Antigone respects only the laws of the gods, not Creon's dictate of leaving her brother Polynices' body unburied, exposed to the weather and scavenging animals. She buries her brother's body, fully aware that her disobedience will result in her death. Creon's son Haemon is betrothed to Antigone. Learning about her being condemned to burying alive, he finds her in the tomb. She has hanged herself. Haemon commits suicide with a sword before his father's eyes. Upon learning of her son's suicide, Eurydice, Creon's wife, commits suicide as well. Creon has manifested his political strength. It is not power, because Creon has conquered Thebes with his army. He has not been elected by Thebes citizens to rule them, according to Hannah Arendt's definition of power. But Creon has paid a high price because he has violated the laws of the gods. And the gods punish him by taking away his son and wife. Antigone speaks of the folly of the fool, the hubris of a man, Creon, who believes that he can establish his own laws against the gods. Let us now move on to 5 critics of censorship. Thanks to Voltaire, the case of Jean Calas, a Huguenot textile worker from Toulouse, became known as the Calas affair. The great philosopher unleashed a press campaign revealing the corruption in France's legal system. The Calas affair gained notoriety throughout Europe. What had happened? In 1761, the son of Jean Calas, who had intended to convert to Catholicism, was found hanged in his father's textile shop. The judge's anti-Huguenot prejudices influenced the verdict with the biased argument that Jean Calas would rather have his son killed than let him convert. He was sentenced to death and executed. Voltaire's tireless campaign for religious tolerance led to the establishment of a commission investigating the case. The court rehabilitated Jean Calas posthumously in 1765. To the right, you find a subjective choice of mine. These are the texts I think are her best studies and analysis of history and political theory. And my favorite quote, also not completely subjective, of course, is from her The Origins. I quote, "The aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the capacity to form any." End of quote. This gentleman does not need any introduction. You certainly know you all know him, Václav Havel. Again, on the right, the best dramas and essays, meditations dealing with what he thought in the first summer of being elected president. I quote, "Much like the concept of socialism, home and nation, the concept of freedom is but one rung of the ladder on which savvy individuals are moving upwards to advance their professional and political careers, and at the same time, a truncheon with which they can hit anybody who refuses to obey." Now replace home socialism nation with racism, transphobia, or toxic masculinity. And there you have it. That is the situation we are facing today. Havel was the only dissident I know of to point out that the totalitarian dogma inherent in Marxism-Leninism originated in Western political thought. Marx, Engels, and before them, Hegel with his dialectics. In his famous essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, Czech author Milan Kundera, a critic of Havel in their 1969 debate, The Czech Fate, Český úděl, and in French exile since 1975, considered the Soviet occupation as an act of de-Europeanization of Czechoslovakia. Kundera thought that Russia's Asian despotism excluded her from Europe and European culture. He published this essay in 1984 in the New York Review of Books. And it prompted a lively debate among Western and Central European intellectuals about the meaning of the concept of Central Europe, among them Czesław Miłosz, Georgi Konrad, Jacques Rupnik, and Timothy Garton Ash. Kundera was wrong. It was the particular blend of the Russian Orthodox Church's tradition of supporting the political autocracy of the Tsarist governments. I owe this thought, this idea, this analysis to the German historian Holm Sundhausen, who published it in the 1980s sometimes. And Marxist-Leninist totalitarianism. Thus, a blend of Russian Orthodox Christianity and Western Marxism-Leninism. The Russian Orthodox Church never experienced a schism comparable with the divide between the Catholic and Protestant confessions in Europe. Russian Orthodoxy acknowledged the national sub-branches of Bulgarian, Greek, and Serbian Orthodoxy, but never theological secession of the proportion of Protestantism promoted by Wycliffe, Hus, Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. Asian despotism, therefore, had nothing at all to do with the establishment of the totalitarian Soviet bloc, but Marxist-Leninist totalitarian thought and the Russian way of exercising governmental rule, not only applied to other people, but also to their own. This scholar, art historian Camille Paglia, deserves to be called and celebrated as the Cassandra of the US campus. For those of you who are interested in art history or theory of art history, I highly recommend her Sexual Personae. She takes the Nietzschean opposite, Apollinian and Dionysian, and applies it to Western art history. It's an absolutely fantastic read and a real eye-opener. Now, what did she find out as early as 1991? I'm going to quote parts of this very long quote. I quote, "What's happening on campus is I started feeling it 20 years ago. That would be 1971 already. Actually, the way the campus in America was drifting away from intellectual life, the way the campus was becoming a summer camp. So now you see the student services departments are taking over. The universities must be centered around the idea of intellectual discourse, intellectual inquiry. We cannot have speech codes. This is absurd." End of quote. I'm apologizing for the bad quality as all pictures. I downloaded this one from the internet, but you certainly are able to recognize Alexei Navalny, his wife, and their two children. Now, whether one likes Navalny or not, and many Russians don't like him, they think he's a narcissist, but one has to admit he has cojones. He's a courageous person. Of course, I cannot prove it, but I think that Navalny's poisoning and permission to go to Germany with his family was an attempt to get rid of him. Why did the Russian government let them all out? Whoever commanded the poisoning probably assumed he would stay in Germany, which would have been, had it worked, a more elegant way of shutting him up than to simply have him shot in a St. Petersburg side street. Naturally, Navalny saw immediately through this scheme and returned home. The offer to emigrate to the Free West was standard procedure for communist security services when all else failed. The opposite was to make artists who were on tour in the West and suspected of defection or of staying in the West return home. Think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was forced into exile. And let me now present two examples for these two procedures. The first one is the Slovak poetess Hanna Ponická, and the second, the Czech singer Karel Gott. Hanna Ponická is the subject of my next book. I'm working on a political biography about her life and her political writings. The book will be published around this time next year. She was a Slovak poetess and famous author of children's books. She became a dissident because she refused to sign the Anti-Charta, the government-imposed protest of artists, writers, directors, and actors against the first manifesto of Charter 77. Ponická did not sign any Charter 77 manifestos. She was not a member of Charter 77. But her refusal to sign the Anti-Charta was enough for the authorities to mount operation after operation against her. The StB, the Czechoslovak State Security Service, used all means of psychological terror, withheld her pension and revenue from her books, and had her appear for several interrogations. What this frail and immensely courageous elderly lady had to undergo in just 1 year is beyond belief. Here, I translated that from her memoirs, Lukavitské zápisky. After 6 hours of interrogation, she asks the main interrogator, I quote, "Tell me now, what do you want from me?" And he replies, "Retract your contribution to the discussions of the third conference of the Writers' Union, or else you can leave." "No, I did not mean it like that. He held me back when I was about to get up and go home, abroad. We let you out." Like the majority of Slovak and Czech artists, the singer Karel Gott had been pressured into signing the Anti-Charta in February 77. According to recent research by Czech historians, Gott, a cash cow for the regime, left with the Steidl brothers, his music producers, on a tour to Hamburg in West Germany in 1971, from where he did not return. In a letter to Husak was head of state and the party, he condemned censorship and invasion and declared that he would not return. The StB reacted immediately, opening a criminal case. If he did not come back home, they would release a psychiatric assessment to the press that indicated sexual deviation. They also threatened to interrogate his parents. These were devilish threats. The artist was not married, and an assessment hinting at a possible homosexual orientation or pedophilia signed by a psychiatrist would have immediately finished Gott's career in West Germany, while his elderly parents would have had to endure the psychological terror of interrogation and social isolation. Gott returned home, case closed. Here, just a remark about what I think is one of the best kept and last secrets of the former bloc states. To the best of my knowledge, and I have inquired wherever I could, there is still no study available that investigates the role of psychologists and psychiatrists in the service of the socialist regime. I find it hard to believe that KGB and StB personnel, politically indoctrinated to the core and used to obey, not to think, would have been capable of planning such sophisticated and elaborate schemes of psychological terror and manipulation without expert advice. Who instructed them? And why were there no investigation commissions with regard to psychiatrists and psychologists after the fall of socialism? Were these psychiatrists and psychologists hired by the state security services on exclusively oral contracts in order not to have any documentary evidence left in the StB archives? Or were these documents, if these contracts existed, the first to be shredded when the people stood up against the party in 1989? You see questions over questions related to the role of psychiatrists and psychologists. Isaiah Berlin explains the totalitarian mindset. I quote, "If I know that I'm right, if I know that what I seek is the true good, then people who oppose me must be in error about what it is they themselves seek. No doubt they too think that they are seeking the good. They assert their own liberty to secure it, but they are seeking it in the wrong place. Therefore, I have right to prevent them. In virtue of what have I this right to prevent them? It is because if they knew what they truly wanted, they would seek what I seek. The fact that they do not seek this means that they do not really know the circularity of the mindset, the totalitarian mindset. This gentleman, who left us all too early, was an excellent analyst of French political thought of the 19th and 20th centuries. And here I have to draw your attention to the title. The patronizing arrogance of the anointed initiated is not Tony Judd's title. I added this title because I think it can explain very well the quote below. I quote, "It is one thing to say that I'm willing to suffer now for an unknowable but possibly better future. It is quite another to authorize the suffering of others in the name of that same unverifiable hypothesis. This, in my view, is the intellectual sin of the century, passing judgment on the fate of others in the name of their future as you see it." End of quote. Before I come to the conclusion, a little bit of humor, I think I would like to share with you, because all of my Czech and Slovak friends told me we survived with humor. We made fun of everything. There was no political correctness, let alone identity politics, morals in totalitarianism. And my absolutely favorite joke is from Czechoslovak psychiatrist circles, those who did not emigrate after the invasion of 1968. I quote, "What are the three biggest sexual perversions? Pedophilia, zoophilia, and love of the Soviet Union." End of quote. Hannah Arendt, and by now it must be obvious to you how much I admire this lady with three brains, lucidly recognized a temporary alliance in Germany prior to the Nazi party being elected. The temporary alliance of the intellectual elite and the mob. I think the situation on contemporary US campuses is very similar to what she described. Naturally, today's IP activists on campus have different motives than the brown-shirted troopers. Yet I am wondering why so many presidents, faculty, and administrative personnel are caving into the student mob's demands. Is this caving in based solely on financial aspects of university budget policy? Or is it perhaps also partly based on something else? A psychological fascination with physical violence? I quote parts of Arendt's explanation. The temporary alliance between the elite and the mob rested largely on this genuine delight, with which the former, the elite, watched the latter, the mob, destroy respectability. And what also reminded me of today's situation, to this aversion of the intellectual elite for official historiography, to its conviction that history, which was a forgery anyway, might as well be the playground of crackpots, must be added the terrible, demoralizing fascination in the possibility that gigantic lies and monstrous falsehoods can eventually be established as unquestioned facts. I end. I'm coming to the conclusion. I've listed totalitarian regimes here, post-totalitarian, and I'm going to explain the difference just right now. What distinguishes the totalitarian from an authoritarian regime? The totalitarian regime attempts to transform the individual from within and change man's nature. It aims at reconstructing man's thinking and emotions, his psychological makeup. In his speech to the Soviet Writers' Congress in August 1934, Andrei Azhdanov, 1896 to 1948, explained Stalin's genius. Writers should be engineers of the human soul. According to Marxist-Leninist thinking, man is living matter, and there is no life after death, no metaphysics. Man's emotions, thoughts, and soul are intrinsic to physiological matter and die with him. Furthermore, man can be taught, his consciousness can be transformed with the proper ideology, much as one can construct a machine. The task of Soviet writers was thus to transform citizen souls with proper indoctrination, suitable novels and poems. And the art form of socialist realism should have reconstructed the citizenry as true communists. The political scientist Juan J. Linz, 1926 to 2013, was the first to coin the concept of post-totalitarianism. Is post-totalitarianism a regime that has liquidated the basic pillars of a totalitarian system, having embarked on a path towards democratization and liberalization? No. Post-totalitarianism was a new form of totalitarianism, characterized by institutional corruption. For an example, the person who was appointed rector of Charles University in 1969 did not even have the matura, never accomplished the course of study at a university, but he was a party member. Then the society was divided into the party nomenclatura on top. In the middle, you have a gray zone, those who obey do not lose their jobs. And the second class citizen at the bottom of the hierarchy, the dissidents. The dissidents created a second culture. Václav Bělohradský called it the parallel polis. They lived on their own, within their own little societies. And of course, what signifies the party members is careerism and opportunism. And this careerism and opportunism we could explain as follows. The slogan of the totalitarian party member, the party member in the totalitarian regime, is we hold governmental power, we hold governmental rule because we want to build communism. Clear causal relation. The party member in post-totalitarian times would say, because we hold governmental rule, we want to build communism. So you see, it's completely the opposite. That's the careerism and opportunism of the party members. Distinguishing the totalitarian from the post-totalitarian regime, the Czech psychologist Jindřich Kabát, in his study Psychologie komunismus, the psychology of communism, published in Prague in 2011, speaks of primary and secondary fear. The primary fear is about my physical survival. Under Stalin, I fear for my life. The secondary fear is more subtle in psychological terms. Under Husak, I fear losing my job, that my children do not get access to university education, that my holidays in Yugoslavia are cancelled, that I end up in prison if I protest. Why can we describe the cult of censorship of IP activists with the concept neo-totalitarian? I think that they are trying to create a new man and a new society. The socially aware man, woman, whatever gender is on vogue right now, rejects objectivity, individualism, and universalism, and focuses on marginalized groups of people perceived as being oppressed. Yet the oppressed are individuals. So how could this be logically consistent? And what goals are they pursuing? Will they be content if they have us all beaten into silence, done away with capitalism, and extinguished racism? If I have properly understood their goals, then their goals are not only not realizable, but convey the madness of this cult. The goal of a society completely free of marginalization and discrimination is comparable to the planned creation of the communist new man or the pure Aryan race dominating the world. Utopianism is too kind a word for such an endeavor. My bottom line is to speak of what it is de facto. It is a cult. It is a neo-totalitarian cult of censorship exercised by IP activist groups and social justice warriors. It's manifest in deplatforming, denunciation, and defamation on social media, on US campuses with witch hunts and mob anarchy. Can we afford not to stand up against this neo-totalitarian cult of censorship? Let me finish with a quote by a great American thinker. Thomas Sowell once said that there are no goals, only trade-offs, meaning that a liberal and open society operates with tolerance, pluralism, and the art of the compromise, an essential element of democracy. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Baer. That was a most perceptive presentation. There is a lot I can agree. There is a lot I learned from what you said. But since we don't have much time left, just let me raise 2 points, and I wish you could comment on those 2 points. I feel there is some kind of disagreement between us. First, Voltaire, who for you, I understand, was an important man in the struggle for or against censorship for freedom of speech. Well, I consider Voltaire to be a despicable man, and I understand that the Jean Calas affair was an outrage. There's no doubt about it, and he was right. But if you read his book on tolerance, the Treatise on Tolerance, his anti-Christian or anti-Catholic fanaticism I find most disquieting. And I can imagine, had he lived today, he would have been on every talk show from Oprah Winfrey to any other, and écraser l'infâme would be écraser racism and homophobia. He will be at the forefront of identity politics and political correctness. But my problem, my question is, I mean, this fanatical anti-religion or anti-Catholicism is something that is also at the bottom of today's cult of censorship and political correctness. How would you reconcile your admiration for Voltaire and your criticism of political correctness and all that follows from it?
Thank you very much, Professor Legutko, for this is a very good question. Voltaire, you're of course absolutely right about it. He was very fiercely anti-Catholic. But I think if we go back and we look at his activities from trying to put ourselves into his shoes in the 18th century, he wanted to pursue the goal of religious tolerance. Back then, at exactly this time when the Jean Calas affair happened, which he so fiercely engaged in, he saw there was a concerted government activities under Louis XIV, I think, to completely erase Protestantism. And Voltaire stood up against that. That's why he had to flee basically to first to a Protestant state, to Frederick II of Prussia, and then later he settled in Geneva. I don't think we can make a connection to IP, identity politics, or I might have not understood your question properly, because identity politics is very particular. Of course, the fight for religious tolerance was also particular back in those times, but I do not see a connection to IP activism.
It's anti-religion, fierce anti-religion, anti-Christianity. That is one of the major vehicles of political correctness, right? So that's why I used his famous phrase, écraser l'infâme. L'infâme for him could have been also John Paul II and Catholic Church and Christian or Catholic communities in Europe and in the States.
I think I understood you now. Anti-religion, a liberal society should absorb and offer that pluralism that I can express my anti-religious views. That's freedom of speech. If I'm not allowed to say that, then it's not really a free society. It must be allowed, if it to be allowed, I have to be able to live in an open society. I have to be able to refuse to go to church or to refuse to adhere to any religious confession, free church, cult, sect, whatever. This liberty has to be granted. And then I think it's up to every individual what he chooses. But the choice must be granted by the state.
I think he was the patron of laïcité, which is state-controlled anti-religion politics, anti-Christian politics. But let me pass on to the second question, which is more theoretical. You said, you quoted Isaiah Berlin, and his argument was that a certain philosophical or ideological intransigence, the feeling that one is the owner of the truth, is at the bottom of the totalitarian temptation, right? This ideological self-assurance. And at the very beginning, you mentioned the French guys, right, Foucault, Derrida, and they were the people who were precisely, they were attacking this kind of approach. They were saying there is no intransigence. Everything is fluid. Everything can be deconstructed and reconstructed at will. This is an opening of mental, philosophical space. And you said they were also kind of influencing this neo-totalitarian thinking. So how can you combine these two views together, accepting Isaiah Berlin's thesis and at the same time criticizing the French philosophers with whom Isaiah Berlin should have been thrilled, I mean, with their ideas, because they were aiming precisely at the same direction that he was going. Is there some kind of a way to reconcile those two views?
I don't think so. You know why? Because there is, if you look at Isaiah Berlin's the totalitarian mindset, it's about that I am telling you how you have to think. Because if you want a true good, then you have to share what I think is the true good, right? I'm not sure if Isaiah Berlin actually, I openly admit I don't know that, what he thought about the French thinkers like Michel Foucault. To my knowledge, he hasn't published anything about it. But what distinguishes the French thinkers, who, you're absolutely right, they were opening up a new philosophical space, right? Michel Foucault was, to my best of my knowledge, the first who wrote about power, and power was in everything, and also about psychiatry from a philosophical perspective. But what distinguishes them from Isaiah Berlin is the quality of the argument. I don't know how better I could put it, because what Derrida then, following Foucault, what Derrida did was deconstruction. You can deconstruct as much as you like, but who later puts the things back together? They don't offer, especially Derrida doesn't offer a solution. He does not offer a solution to the political problems of the reality. It's just theorizing. If I was a really mean person, one could speak of philosophical masturbation. Deconstruction does not help. Explain to me what political problem has deconstruction helped to resolve. I don't know, not one. Political philosophy is practical philosophy. We do not theorize like the theoretical philosophers. Also, Isaiah Berlin was very committed, especially in his publications about Russian thinking and Soviet thinking, very much committed to the literature, to Russian literature, but also the political reality. He was cultural attaché for Great Britain during the war in St. Petersburg, where he met Anna Akhmatova. So he knew absolutely what the Russian world looked like. And of course, I cannot say today what Isaiah Berlin would have thought. That's pure speculation. But I think he would not have much in, if I'm allowed to speculate, and yes, I can do it, he would not have held them in high regard, because he would have, I think he would have seen through, especially Derrida, that deconstruction is not helpful if we tackle, if we seriously want to tackle political problems, such as a state that dictates everything to the citizens. You cannot even move house without the permission of the state. As I focused heavily, of course, on Czechoslovakia because that is my area of expertise. But all over the satellite bloc states was more or less comparable. I don't think Isaiah Berlin, to finish my question, would have held them in high regard. I don't see that, no.
What I was going to say is that people like Derrida and Foucault and other French philosophers, the same orientation, they're extremely popular still at American and European campuses, and the humanities, the literary studies, philosophy, I mean, it's full of their ideas. And their ideas are precisely about subverting the existing power structure, right? About opening, about pluralizing them. So we should be happy. We should welcome them. We people who love freedom, we should love them. And why don't we? I mean, what's wrong with them? I think they're also very dangerous people. But why is it? I mean, if you are if you buy Isaiah Berlin's argument that intransigence, philosophical and metaphysical, is the root of the problem, why should we reject the philosophers who subvert this intransigence and who say that, well, everything is fluid, right? The world is there to be deconstructed and reconstructed. We should be happy. Why is it that they are so dangerous, guys? I mean, what's your position on that? Is it only that no political problem has been solved by the theory, or is it something else?
I don't consider them to be. I mean, it's very simple to tear down things, right? It's very simple. I can criticize anything. I can deconstruct to my heart's delight until the cows come home. But does it solve problems? Does it solve practical problems? Does it solve? I mean, I can go against racism. Yes, we are aware now there is racism. There will always be. It was the homosexuals, lesbian. Finally, they are acknowledged by law that they have the same rights as individuals as anybody else. I have a problem when it gets violent, when open debates are no longer possible. And when you read, this has nothing to do with neither with philosophy or philosophical intransigence. I'm very much for open debates. But if an open debate is no longer possible, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff have published a book about what enlisted events that happened on US campuses, starting, I think, by 2014, going up to today, that a student mob trashes university buildings, that faculty are being taken hostage, that a university president is being talked to in a very rude language. When things like that happen, I think it's going too far. It has nothing to do anymore with liberating mankind or open up a new space or going against the last bastions of discrimination. This is mob. It's mob behavior. This is mob behavior. If a debate between acknowledged scholars would say, or they would agree, perhaps, yes, perhaps the system is not so perfect as we have thought, perhaps we should change, and then come up with suggestions how to make this social change. I would have absolutely nothing to say. I would think, oh, this is wonderful. An academic debate that concentrates, focuses on what we can achieve in reality. But smashing down university buildings, shouting down university presidents, what does that help? It doesn't help at all. It doesn't solve one problem, neither a social nor a political problem.
Okay, if I understood you correctly, and I slightly elaborate on what you said, The problem with those French philosophers is they destroyed the language. There's an assault on the language. The concepts lost the meaning. They do not mean what they used to mean, and the meaning is fluid. Then we cannot really communicate. If we cannot really communicate and everything can be deconstructed, then the only thing that matters ultimately is power.
Yeah.
So contrary to the intention, they even legitimize the use of power. Once we get rid of metaphysics, of classical epistemology, of truth and falsehood, then what we are left with is this ghastly jargon that they use, and in practical terms, it's power. And that we have been observing at campuses all over the world, that students as well as professors use the language that is less and less comprehensible, and there is more and more power on the campuses. Okay, Professor Baer, thank you so much for your presentation and for your answers to my question.
Thank you very much for the questions. Thank you very much.